So it's been a really good study. And then here we are doing our second book of wisdom in 2 weeks, which is a bit challenging. But we're finishing up Job tonight, even though I noticed today, for some reason, in the reading plan, I had you all stop a chapter before the end of Job. I don't know why I would do that, but I think my fingers meant to type a 2 and I typed a 1 instead. But I trust that you found out that you really should finish the book. So we're gonna pick up kind of in the middle of Job just briefly, and then kind of move our way quickly towards the end of it. And it's interesting, either during or after class last week, Matt made the comment that, it's hard to do more than what he called the frame tale of Job in 2 weeks, and that's the truth, right? I mean, when you look at Job, you've got a little prose at the beginning that gives us key information. Then you've got a lot of poetry, a lot of discourses on what's wrong with Job, and Job saying, no, that's not it. And then at the end, you get some more prose telling you kind of what happened. We kind of got into that last week just looking at the first 3 or 4 chapters of Job. And I didn't really kind of plan this study around this idea of, looking a little at this and a little at that, so much as, Job is a study in and of itself, and you just got to pick what you can wrap your head around in a couple of short lessons. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it, and I trust that it'll be instructive as we go through it. At the end of chapter 3, when we talked last week, we've got Job and 3 friends sitting around in silence for a week. And we're going to find out that actually there must be more people there hanging out with Job and listening to the conversation that's going to go on, because we meet a guy later in the book named Elihu, who's been sitting there listening to the conversation the whole time. And he's got some commentary to offer up. So I had always pictured Job as Job sitting over here in the pile of ashes trying to find some sort of relief, some sort of comfort, and all by himself, right? His wife comes over and says, give it up, Job, and then she goes off and he's just by himself. But that's not really the picture. Now I kind of picture it as there's a lot of people there. And his 3 friends come and join the group that's sitting there. And then that's when the conversation takes place. But Job doesn't find any comfort from anyone sitting around him, and he's certainly not going to find comfort from his 3 friends, because they've already kind of made a decision about him. And so for the next 28 chapters, really, what we get is Job's 3 friends trying to convince him that, well, Job, suffering is caused by sin, and you're suffering. Therefore, what'd you do? And that's really their argument, right? And at a certain point, they even say, you know what? Because you just won't admit it, either you can't see it, or you're so far gone that you think it doesn't apply to you. And that's really where his 3 friends are with the arguments. And periodically, Job's going to step in and defend himself. And we're going to see Job talking about, I've not stolen from anybody, I've not mistreated my servants, I've not looked on other women in an inappropriate way, I've not, he kind of runs through the litany and tries to think of, wow, if I could just sit down with God for a couple of minutes and have him explain to me what's wrong, then, but God's ignoring me. So that's really kind of the middle part of Job, and I don't want to minimize that, because there's an awful lot in there. There's an awful lot of teaching in there that is familiar territory, right? I mean, do we not hear today, well, your life has gone bad, you must have done something wrong? Is that not a common, way of thinking about stuff? I think it is. Now, none of us, I think, would argue that we are sinless. that we haven't done anything wrong. But at the same time, what have we learned from looking at Proverbs and Ecclesiastes? Time and chance. Things happen, right? Sometimes things happen to good people for no particular reason. Good things happen to bad things. Sometimes good things happen to bad people for no particular reason. It just goes that way. So just in the study that we've done here, when you look at Eliphaz and Bildad and Job's friends, you kind of say, well, it's not all that. So just from what we've talked about, we should be able to kind of look at that idea and say, that's just not how it works all the time. And that should leave us with a question of, well, then why does it happen? Right? One of the great questions that people like to ask about God, why does God allow suffering? Why does God, who is righteous and good and wonderful, why does he let me suffer? And God never tells Job why. He never tells Job why. He just says, you know what? You need to trust me that I'm in control. But he never tells Job the reason. And so I think sometimes we feel like we got to have the answer to why God allows suffering. And sometimes the answer is, I'm not real sure, but I trust God. And that's the message that he's going to end up giving to Job. So before we jump into the back end of Job, any thoughts or comments about that or anything we talked about last week?
I don't often observe today people looking at someone who is suffering in a very specific way, the way Job did, and saying, they must have sinned. This is why this has happened to them. So I don't see us doing that so much anymore, but what we still do is we think that there has to be a reason. And so, I've known people who have experienced really bad things, happening to them, and people, because they don't know what to say, will say, well, everything happens for a reason, or God's got a plan. Like this terrible thing that's happened to you is part of something bigger, and sometimes we just, we don't know. So to me, those types of explanations are a different form of the same mistake. It's trying to give reason and answers to things that we don't know and can't explain.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, kind of how you phrase that. Because I think you're right. That's generally the answer is that everything happens for a reason, which is a half answer in a way, right? Everything happens for a reason. We just may not know what that reason is, right? And I'm reminded of, I think, again, after class and during class kind of run together. So we may have said this last week, but in the New Testament, when we run across the blind man and the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned? Was it his parents that sinned, that he was born blind? And the answer was, well, no. It was because I'm going to show the glory of God in this man. So we got a reason there, but the point is, there are things going on that we don't know. Matt.
And our society is not, Landon's right. Our society does not say that bad things happen to you because you sinned. But there is a huge strain in American society that if you seek God and are righteous, then you will prosper and be blessed and be happy. So, and really, it's tough to separate those two things.
Yeah, it's a whole cause and effect discussion, right? It just happens to be more on the health and wealth thing as opposed to, righteous people won't suffer, wicked people will suffer, but, we don't focus on the wicked because we're all righteous.
And that being the case, I think that we're surrounded by people who are just as simplistic in their analysis of life as Job's three friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
James tells us, and this is kind of general, it's not specific. But James tells us when we're suffering, it's because we're going to grow in character if we do it with faith. And so that's why we can rejoice in suffering, is because we know we're going to grow in character. And just like, as long as we live, we're never going to know everything. We always have to study, and we'll never know it all. We're always going to lack character. We're never going to be perfect like Jesus. And so it's always an area we're going to have to grow in. And that's a big way that most of the time we set it up is there's going to be suffering, but you're going to grow in character if you deal with it the right way.
Yeah, I think the important thing there, and Gail, in case you didn't hear, was talking about, James talks about when we suffer, there's character to be grown from that. And the idea, and the thing that you said at the end, I think is the important thing, which is if we handle it the right way, which is, that's the essential thing. It's like we can endure temptation and we can handle it the right way or the wrong way. We can suffer injustice and we can handle it the right way or the wrong way. And our growth depends on the proper handling of that. When we see Job, we're introduced to Job as a man who's got it all going in his favor. It's all rolling right for him. And as he suffers more and more and more and more, we see him struggling to maintain his integrity, right? And we see him, he won't curse God, but he starts to question, and again, his words make us a little uncomfortable, right? Because he's like, I don't understand. Why has God abandoned me? Why is God, just not, not paying any attention to my plight? Why is he not working with me and helping me? He recognizes that he needs that assistance from God, but he's not getting it. He doesn't know why. Matt.
And even more than that, Job actually blames God. He says, God has done all this stuff to me, and he's doing it to me unfairly. And there we get really uncomfortable.
Yep.
And yet God's verdict at the end is that Job has spoken rightly.
Yeah, because ultimately what has happened? God has allowed Satan to do these things to him. And so, and I think really too, Job speaks rightly that I don't understand it, but my, God has laid this on me. It's just the reason that he's really missing, and he's not seeing it. And we talked about this last week at the very beginning of Job, and one of the key points, I think, that Job really brings home really well is that there's a whole other world going on out there that we don't know anything about. We don't know what's going on spiritually. We know there is spiritual warfare happening. We don't know what that means even. We get little glimpses of it, little pieces of it, but we don't know what that means. And so it's a little presumptuous of us to think that we can apply human reason to, I can explain it all. And so I think Landon's right. People, well-meaning people who are looking at somebody suffering saying everything happens for a reason, but there's more to that answer that needs to be there, which is, everything may be happening for a reason, and we may never understand what that reason is. Trust in God. Just trust God that there is a reason, that there is an explanation, that there is a basis for this, and from that, you'll be okay. Anything else?
Sometimes there may not be a reason. We have insight into Job, we have insight into the blind man, but what was true of that blind, while that was true of the blind man, that his purpose for being born blind was to bring glory to God through Christ. It's also true that the world at that time, just like now, was full of blind men. And not all of them were there to bring glory to God by being blind. So sometimes there is no reason.
That's absolutely true, and I overspeak by saying that because you're right. And actually, we talked about that before, right? Time and chance, right? Sometimes there isn't a reason other than time and chance. Sometimes things just are. And so we have to account for all of that when we're thinking about what's going on around us. Do you have a thought, Matt?
I was reflecting that something horrible can happen in a Christian's life as a random event, but the way that they react to that can invest the event with meaning. Because, in my life, some of the most impressive displays of godliness that I've ever seen have come from people who were suffering with some incredible tragedy. Their child has died. They've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And yet they pull themselves together and they seek God even in that. And the impression can linger on for decades because there is something sublime when a Christian does that.
Yeah, and I think our reaction is the only thing we can control in those circumstances, right? Which is really important. Again, the discussions from the scripture, in different examples of that, right? When Jesus is talking to Peter and he says, he's talking about how things are going to go. And Peter points to John and says, what about this guy? And Jesus says, well, what's it to you if I want him to live until I come back? Just you follow me. And that's the relationship that we're getting from Job here too. He's like, just trust me. Just trust me. And that's can be the hardest thing when you don't see the reason. And so many people have turned their back on the Lord because they can't see the reason. Because they can't summon the trust. And the way we do that, among other things, is what we're doing right now, which is we look at the scripture and we see times when there is no reason for Job he can't grasp what's going on. He doesn't get it. And we see his reaction, we see the strain that it puts on him, and we see that there is, in fact, other stuff going on that he can't understand, and he chooses not to turn his back on God. The things that we do, either by prayer or study or association and conversation about these kinds of issues, are the things that prepare us for what might be around the corner. We'd all hate for that to happen, but how do you prepare? How are you ready for it? You're not ready for it, but how do you gather the strength to do what must be done at that point? Andy?
In the beginning, when he said that, when he made the statement that Job is only following after you because you put a hedge around him, that because everything is good for him, he's not acting out of faith, he's acting out of, quid pro quo type thing. And if our suffering was directly correlated to our sin, and our good blessings were directly correlated to our righteousness, then that would be the case. That there wouldn't be any faith. It would all be based on what you've earned.
It's a transaction.
As a transaction. And so Satan, I think, inadvertently revealed the truth of how faith works.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's interesting that after all of the speech making that Job's friends give and all the defenses that Job gives to it, that when Elihu speaks up, who is this young man that's been sitting there the whole time, he doesn't go back to that same old argument. In fact, he's mad at the three friends saying, you guys haven't been convincing. And Job, you've questioned God. And so when Elihu is talking, his whole thing is about, first things first, let's remember the glorious nature of God. Let's remember God as just, ultimately beyond all that we can comprehend. And in that, Elihu hits on the key point, which is you questioning God is not a fair exchange. You have no reason to be able to question God. He is so much greater than we are. that the idea that you're asking God, you know, to answer you why is kind of laughable, because it's not, you have no standing with God to do that. And so when he gets to the point of that, what he says is the real situation isn't the reason why you're suffering, it's how you're handling the suffering and the things that you're saying. Your friends aren't doing you any favors, but Job, you're not really, you know, focusing and giving God enough credit for who he is, and you're not really understanding that there is value in even the situation that you're in. Yes, sir.
Completely. What we need around us and what we need to understand is we need other Christians. Eliphaz started it off on a bad note as far as I'm concerned. He said, well, you know, Job, you instructed other people. You strengthened the weak knees. You helped those that can't do things for themselves and so on. When it comes upon you, basically you can't take it. That's not the way Christians react to other people who have problems. You have to understand that problem and be with it. Job was doing that with other people, but yet when it hit him, it's hard for one person to go through that without a support group.
Yeah, and I don't know how many people heard Lee. Lee's talking about the value of having other people help you and support you. And certainly Job's friends, not really helpful, right? But in the context of being Christians, that's instructive, right? Because we do need each other. We do need to be able to support one another. And sometimes that comes with investing a little time and thinking about what you're going to say before you actually say it. And being willing to be instructed by, you know, other people who might be able to put it better. You know, the support that we need to offer to one another needs to be coming from someplace deeper. We're in a relationship with one another. We should know that. We should be able to reach out to one another with empathy, with sympathy, with love, and with concern. And not everybody is great at that, but everybody can do it with a little effort and forethought. I'm a guy that tends to say the wrong thing sometimes, and I have to control myself. I have to stop what I'm saying and think about what is the appropriate way to approach that person. And so I think you're right there, Lee. I think the other thing that Elihu does kind of at the end of this is, you know, he says, listen, you're in no place to criticize God. You need to remember to have respect and fear and recognize God for the place that he's in. And where we get from this is as we get to the end, who is God upset with? Well, first of all, he's upset with Job, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But he's upset with Job's three friends. Who does he not talk to? Elihu. He doesn't, you know, Elihu gets off. So you've got to figure that if God's in the process of rebuking the speakers here, he's okay with what Elihu has presented. And so he kind of comes in out of nowhere. He kind of makes his points, and then he just kind of disappears as a spokesman of what is right. Matt.
Maybe the key is in the next to the last verse of what Elihu says in Job 37:23. You know, the Almighty, we cannot reach him. He is exalted in power. He will not violate justice and abundant righteousness. That you have a God whom you cannot understand, but you know that he is just. And ultimately, his justice and his mercy will work themselves out in the life of the righteous somewhere. And you know that I think is ultimately the answer to the problem of suffering, because you know you have this cute dilemma that the atheist poses, but where does that leave the atheist? You're just a bug being squashed beneath the uncaring food of the universe. Whereas the righteous can know that even if they are suffering, that they suffer in hope.
Yeah, and I think that feeds the whole half answer versus whole answer discussion thing, right? It's not just trusting God, but it's trusting God and know that God is ultimately just, that he is ultimately in control, that ultimately God, is above and beyond anything that we are going to ever comprehend. And because of that, we can have trust in him, which is kind of where, at the point God decides to speak up in chapter 38, that's really the gist of the discussion, right? God is going to talk to Job, and he's basically going to say, get ready, I have a few questions for you now. And he takes it through a couple of different directions, and I think it's interesting that, at least as I see it, when I look at how he's talking about it, he talks about really 4 different areas. The first thing he kind of talks about to Job, he says, let's talk about creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me a few things about how I did that. And he talks about foundations and measurements and borders and the borders of the seas and all of these things that he set up. Do we know any of that today, by the way? Do we know what the deepest borders of the seas are? We've been there, checked it all out, we understand it all. We don't have that yet, right? Close, but not there yet, right? And when we get there, we probably still won't know what it is. And that's the thing. He's talking about fundamental questions of the universe that we might have a mathematical model that kind of fits what we know right now. But when we know something else, maybe the model doesn't work anymore. And that's kind of been the history of man's reasoning about the foundations of the world and the creation of the world and the limitations of the seas and how land, why does wet dirt clump together? Well, we might understand that now, but we didn't back then. We just knew it was, And so, we learn more things and we have more answers, but then we end up with more questions as well. And God's just saying, hey, you know what? If you were there, you should be able to tell me. If you have the answer, explain to me creation, because I did it. I just want to know, how I did it. Explain it to me. And I feel that way a lot when I hear, I don't feel it in a mocking way. I have tons of respect for scientists and people who are doing all of this research into all of this chemistry and all of this astrophysics and all the other stuff that's going on there. But I'm like, I don't see it. I don't see how this equation explains this to me. And that's really, and God's not even asking Job for the math. He's just saying, give me some simple answers. What was this like? Yes, Lauren.
And ultimately, we only know as much as we know. We have been dead, we, humanity, have been dead sure before that we knew the right answer. The sun revolves around the earth.
Yeah.
And then we find out, oh, no, never mind. Okay. And then we have to reevaluate. And even if we get to the bottom of the ocean, how do we know we just haven't found a deeper part yet? That ultimately, going back to what Matt said, that the God who is bigger and smarter than we are hampered by the limits of who we are intrinsically. We can't get around that.
Yeah, and God goes so far as to point that out to Job, right? He talks about how many years do you have, Job? If you've got enough years, you should be able to explain this. But we're not going to have enough years to get to that explanation. So he starts at creation, but then the next thing he starts talking about is fundamentals of nature. He says, all right, how about snow? Where's the storehouse of snow? Where's the storehouse of hail, right? How about light and dark? You want to explain that one to me? How about thunder? How about grass? How about ice? How about constellations? You're like, just tell me how that works. I set it up. How did it work? How did I do it? What did I do? How did I put these things in motion? And I see why God told him to stand up like a man at the beginning of this. Because he's only going to get smaller and smaller and smaller the more God talks. Because there's no way anyone could stand up before that and not just kind of continually shrink down. So, and then he moves on to a third section, which is, okay, well, how about just how things work? Tell me how dust clumps together, right? Tell me about horses and why horses run to battle as opposed to run away. Tell me about hawks and eagles and lions and why they make nests where they do and why they put eggs where they do. Explain it to me. And at that point, he kind of leaves it up to Job to see what he wants to do, because he says in chapter 40 and verse 2, he says, "Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it." So God says, here's your chance. Let me hear what it is you have to say. And Job does a very smart thing. He basically says, I can't put my hand over my mouth fast enough. He basically has no answer. And that's the right answer. Because we talk about the judgment. We talk about kneeling before God on the day of judgment. It is going to be so much bigger than this. It's going to be so much more overwhelming than this. And, people say, oh, I'll just talk to God and I'll tell him why I did. No, you won't. I mean, to be in the presence of God, you see what it does to Job, a man who was blameless and shunned evil. How am I going to stand before him? Only by Jesus. I'm not going to be able to do it. The last thing God talks about after this, and I think this is the thing, God's questioning kind of brings this all to a bigger level. It's not about justice or being just or unjust in law. It's about the complexities of the universe and the things that we have no answers for. And so God says, I understand these things and you don't. So now, let's compare you and me for a minute. And he says, the last part of this is God saying, can you do what I do? Can you make the wicked man see his wickedness? Can you make the proud man humble? Can you do these things? Which isn't even about answering the why questions. It's just, what power do you have in comparison? Because that's, again, we're talking about, does Job have standing to ask God these questions? And obviously the answer is, no, he really doesn't. And I think that when God talks about the things that I can't explain tonight, so don't ask. I don't know what the Leviathan is, right? And I cannot call out, the behemoth. I don't know, I know it looks like some pretty fierce creatures, but I don't know what they are. But at the end of it, Job does the second very smart thing that he does, which he says, God, you can do anything. And in chapter 42, he says, you ask, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me that I did not know. And then verse 6, therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. You know, Job basically says, yeah, I spoke without any wisdom at all. Everything that I said, just not worth it. You know? And I say that that's the second thing that Job does that's really smart here, because it basically goes back to the character that we're introduced with in chapter 1. Remember last week we said Job was not a sinless man. We know that to be true. But Job knew what to do when he did sin. He knew what to do to seek forgiveness. And he knew that in this case, what he really needed to do was just repent and lay himself out before the Lord. And that's a really smart man, because there's nothing else he can do, you know, which God has effectively demonstrated for the last 3 chapters. You know. So with that, then the question becomes, can Job trust God without knowing why? And he can. Because his reaction to the things that God tells him sets him up to be accepting of whatever God gives him. You know, and again, back at the very beginning of Job, he says, shall we accept good and not, you know, difficulty? Well, he's back there now. And he's like, God, you do what you want to do, because I don't understand. Doesn't mean I have a right to question any of that. So that kind of fit. Thoughts there?
Yeah. It's important to remember that Job gets what he wanted. This is what he wanted. He wanted an audience with God. He wanted to have an opportunity to explain himself, or to have God explain to him what was going on. And it doesn't work out the way he thought it would, but he wasn't wrong to want that. It's a good thing to want, because it's what Adam and Eve had in the garden. They were there with God. It's what, you know, Jacob wrestled with God and refused to let go until God blessed him. Moses wanted to see him. All throughout the Bible, we have all these men and women of faith who were seeking God, and it's what we want. You know, the reason to go to heaven is to no longer be separated from God, to be able to stand in His presence unashamed. And as intimidating as that may be, there's still something there that we should all be desiring. And the other thing that's interesting about everything that God tells Job is He tells him not only things that He did in the creation and has done, but is still doing in sustaining everything that we see around us. And that's something else that the Bible clearly teaches us, that God did not simply set things in motion and now set separate from all that goes on around us, but that He is still very present and responsible for His creation even today.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that Job, you're right, Job gets what he wants. It doesn't work out like he thought, right? I mean, in all of his defenses, oh, that I could ask, you know, I could talk to God, and it turns out he can't. He's so overwhelmed that he can't really talk to God. But you're right, it is what he wanted. It's what we all should want, is that the elimination of that separation. Yes, ma'am.
And I think part of it, looking back at some of what Job says, is that he wanted to talk to God, but that was because he was sure he had the answer and God just didn't understand. And that's part of what I struggle with Job, because from other places in the Bible, I think it's appropriate and acceptable for us to go, God, why? Why? I don't understand this. This is hard. Where Job crosses that line is when he starts going, no, I know why, and God is wrong about this. And that's where God comes in and says, you don't know as much as you think you do. That we have to be careful when we want to talk to God, that we're not coming in guns blazing because we already know the answer, like my 11-year-old does with her parents.
It is remarkable how having children kind of clarifies that I know the answer, you're wrong, Mom. You know, And I don't, and I mean, we all smile when we think about, our kids doing that, but it really is, the maturity that you have as a parent versus the maturity of your young child is, it's not anywhere near the gap between God and the most wise man that ever walked, but it gives you a glimpse of how God looks at the way people sometimes approach him. And it goes back to something I mentioned before for us is, being godly requires a lot of thought. It requires a lot of thinking ahead before you engage your mouth in talking to a brother, in approaching God. When we pray to God and we lay out things in front of him, be thinking about and remembering who we're talking to and remembering that we don't necessarily know why or what, but we got to think it through. And I think when we flash back into, okay, we're trying to be the light, and we talked about, or Matt talked Sunday, I think, about, not the source of the light, be the light. The light is reflecting off of us from God. This is one of the ways that we do that. We learn from Job that even a righteous man will cross the line sometimes if he's not careful in the midst of great suffering, So God doesn't excuse what is said just because there is suffering. He says you got to push through that. Now, the interesting thing to me is that at the end of this discourse, it's not the three friends that have to offer sacrifices. They need to bring sacrifices to Job so he can sacrifice for them, so he can intervene on their behalf. And I think that's huge. Matt?
It's interesting that they came to help Job, and in the end, they need Job's help.
Yeah, because it's not over until Job intervenes for them. Providing the sacrifice isn't enough. And it's consistent with Job's character, because what did he do for his children when they had their feasting weeks? He sanctified them, he sacrificed for them, and he prayed for them in case they messed up. So again, Job is re-engaging with his character prior, and God ends up giving him, much of the same, or more of what he enjoyed before the suffering. I don't want to say everything went back to normal, because he still had the loss. He still had the suffering. But now he's been restored to a place where, he has the respect, he has the family, he has the blessings of God going for him. And so when you think about the way that Job fits into this whole study that we're doing about being the light, Job talks about trusting God when we don't get it, when we don't understand that we need to put trust in God as enough. Psalms taught us, from the stuff that we looked at way back in the first couple of weeks, that God's got a plan. And he's brought a lot of it to fruition, and there's more to be satisfied. And then Proverbs gives us that practical grounding that says there are guidelines for how to live your life successfully. They don't work 100% of the time. There are always exceptions. But that wisdom that you can demonstrate makes you a person that is approachable, and therefore makes you a dispenser of light, if you want to think about it that way. Because when people are asking you questions about how to live their life, you have the opportunity to say, there's a spiritual side of this too. And then you can reflect that light. And that's what Ecclesiastes gives us, is there are all these life pursuits, there are all these journeys that you can go into, but you can't forget that there is a spiritual element to all of them that God is watching over, and that God has given you the opportunity to enjoy, and you should take advantage of that opportunity. And you should remember that ultimately, even if things don't work out in this life, God has control, and God will make it just in the end. Last thoughts, anybody? Wow, this has been a really good study for me. It's really been helpful. I appreciate all of your content and contributions to the class. Thank you all very much.
The King of Kings.